Today we're going to talk about introductions and conclusions. Part of the introduction and conclusion is going to be how to develop paragraphs, and you'll notice that a lot of the feedback that you guys got on your last paper are going to be answered, or at least I'm going to answer the question how to make your next paper stronger. An introduction is where you set up your argument. It's where you identify perhaps a widely held assumption and challenge the assumption and state your thesis. That's one way. An introduction can take several paragraphs to establish the context for an argument. A couple of you actually did this and did it very well. In Comp 2, you'll have more introductions that are more complex, and you might want to do this. You theoretically could do it with the rhetorical analysis because you would have an interesting hook paragraph, and then you have your context paragraph, and then you come down to your thesis. And so the thesis always goes the last sentence of the introductory paragraph or paragraphs if there are multiples. And then this is where you establish your tone, figure out what the context is for your argument. With rhetorical analysis, we specifically want to know the situation, the audience, and the purpose need to be in your introduction to provide context for your reader so that you've established what the source essay is, who the source author is, what's the situation that caused them to write or to speak, and then who their intended audience directly or indirectly is, and then their purpose. And then with the rhetorical analysis, you'd end with a thesis statement about the effectiveness of the source material. We're going to talk today about 5 different introduction strategies, and I do have a slide for each one of these, so don't feel like you have to be quick in writing them down. There's the inverted triangle, the narrative introduction, interrogative, which just means question, paradox, good student, bad son. When we get to paradox, I'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll just briefly discuss minding the gap, which tends to be more focused on science and behavioral science. An inverted triangle is essentially a funnel. It's a broad topic at the very start, and then you come and you narrow it down to the base. So it begins with a general statement of the topic and narrows the focus. You see this frequently. I think a lot of students naturally go this way. I don't know if that's the way they teach in high school or if this is just more of an intuitive design. But an example is if you were going to write an argument about poverty, you might start with poverty in the United States, narrow it down to poverty in Colorado, and then further narrow it at the tip of the funnel to poverty in Colorado Springs. And then at the very tip of the paragraph, the very end of the paragraph, is the writer's thesis. So that funnel leads your reader into your point or your thesis, the idea that you're going to get across in your essay. The strategy of this kind of opening is to identify an idea, an argument, or a concept that people appear to accept as true, pointing out the problems with that idea, that argument or concept, and then in the thesis, how these problems can be resolved. And that's your goal in an argument. The narrative introduction, creative writers tend to default to this one. It's opening with a short narrative or story to draw the reader into your topic. It works well to draw in a reluctant reader. There's a essay we sometimes read in my class called Scholarship Boy, and the very first line is, "I walk into the ghetto classroom." That's a very intentional attention-grabbing technique. We have kind of a visceral reaction to the word ghetto, and so when he uses that, and he's an educated man, he grew up in the ghetto, he understands what he's saying, he's drawing us in like, whoa, what are you talking about here? That's the kind of thing you want to do, and he goes on to tell us this narrative story about why he's in this, quote, ghetto classroom. The narrative is really designed to help draw your reader in, and if you're a creative writer, this is a chance to put some creativity into a story in your introduction. So what Parker does is a little bit of a narrative in a way. She starts with some questions, but she also tells us her story. Choose a story that clearly connects to your argument and get to your thesis quickly so readers don't wonder what's the point. So even though I encourage the use of narrative introduction, don't spend all your time and all your word count on that narrative. Make sure that you're telling a concise story and getting to the point. An interrogative introduction is a question. It invites the readers into the essay with a question, and several of you have already started doing that, either intuitively or that's the way you're taught. It works because you're asking the reader a question and immediately engaging them. You ask me what is poverty is the way Parker starts hers, and then the rest of the essay answers that question. It gets the reader's attention, enticing them to continue reading your insights. Hopefully you have some. And then by the end of the introduction, the reader knows exactly what question is driving the essay. And that's ultimately what you want. Your thesis is designed to say, hey reader, over here, this is what we're going to be talking about today. The paradoxical introduction. A paradox is a seemingly absurd or self-contradictory statement, such as good student, bad son. So when I go back to that essay, Scholarship Boy, he says that he's a good student and a bad son. And that's a paradox because most parents want their kids to be good students. So why does this make him a bad son? And so we read to find out how those two things can be true. It appeals to the reader's curiosity as it runs counter to our expectations. The Minding the Gap introduction, we don't often use in English. I have had a student do it. He did a research project in Comp 2 where he did his own experiment on whether or not people could tell the difference between food that was grown organically and food that was sold in the regular produce aisle. And so he was trying to find this gap in research that wasn't so much about the health benefits, but whether people could actually tell the taste against it. And so it calls the reader's attention to a gap in the research on an issue and then uses the rest of the essay to fill that gap. The student that I had that started looking at the elderly when it comes to gun control, that's where something was missing and he wanted to have that conversation. Again, this isn't something we typically use in English, but you will sometimes see it. It's a place where you see there's a gap in research, so when you get into upper level psychology courses or science classes, you may need to figure out where there's a gap in the research. Developing your paragraphs. So there were several of you guys in the last paper where you kind of circle around the same idea without making a point. In the thesis slides, we talked about the thesis is a skewer that holds your paper together. If the thesis is a skewer, the paragraphs are the meat. This is the basis of what you're trying to prove to your reader. Each paragraph has the burden of proof. It is responsible for providing evidence to support your thesis. It should have a topic sentence, and many of you guys either weren't taught this or somehow forgot that this was a thing, but your first paragraph establishes the topic, the first sentence of every paragraph establishes your topic. It says this is going to be the main focus of this particular paragraph. If you think about your life slides or your photo essays, depending on which of my classes you were in, one picture is equal to one paragraph. So in other words, you wouldn't mix pictures of your hobbies with pictures of your career goals. You would have one focus on each of your slides or each of your paragraphs. It should be unified in the focus. So if you're arguing about poverty, you wouldn't start a paragraph talking about Denver poverty and then switch midstream to Colorado Springs poverty or PPCC poverty. You would want to maintain one focus for each individual paragraph and stay focused on that one topic. Topic sentences should focus the paragraph. They act as an extension of your thesis. And if you look back at that thesis, the thesis slides, they demonstrate how this works. It's an extension of the question motivating the argument. So what is poverty? Notice that she does her topic sentence very simply, and it's effective. It serves as a guidepost or a map to your reader, providing unity and coherence. So one of the things Parker does in What is Poverty, she establishes that question early on. She tells us what her thesis is, and then every sentence starts with a topic sentence, such as poverty is dirt. And then when she goes to make her concession, she'll say, but you say, what about health clinics? And so that very first sentence grounds the reader and says, this is what we're talking about. And then your job is to stay focused on that. Each paragraph should focus on the subject presented in the topic sentence. The details should flow from the topic sentence and maintain that singular focus. Use transition words and phrases as you move through the essay. If you think back to that hermit crab template assignment We said this person says one thing and this person says another, and this is what I think. Those are the phrases used in that template are designed to kind of walk you through the language for transitioning from one point to the next. Strategies. So within each paragraph, you need to use examples and illustrations, and that varies depending on the kind of paper it is. Examples and illustrations in the argument of definition essay meant examples and evidence from your lived experience. In a research assignment, it might be citing data or analyzing text. So a rhetorical analysis is analyzing text. And so you're looking at things like, what are the implications of something? What are the cause and effects of something? Are there connections? You can also provide a narrative or an anecdote, or just a sequence of events, which is essentially what Parker does, but the sequence of events all focus on that one theme of poverty is dirt or poverty is smelly. Make sure that you define your terms. Don't assume that your reader tracks with you and has the same experience, the same knowledge, or that they interpret a word or phrase in the same way you do. Make comparisons. Some of you guys had some really excellent comparisons, some similes in there that were pretty awesome, some analogies which were great. You can also examine cause and consequence. So what is the cause of homelessness? What are the consequences of homelessness? One way that you can develop your ideas, and for several of you, if you lost points in the development, this is the area to work on this time. I call it TEAL. T stands for your topic sentence. Establish your focus immediately in that first line. Poverty is dirt. E is for evidence. Evidence in the form of examples and illustrations. With research, that examples and illustrations may be from your research documents. In the rhetorical analysis, your evidence is going to be quotes and summaries from your source document. And then after you lay down your evidence, your example, you need to analyze it. You need to explain to the reader what it means. Don't assume the reader thinks the way you think. This can be in the form of comparisons, cause and consequences, implications, things that we've talked about in the past. Make sure you show the reader the reasoning behind your example. And you may need to do this on multiple times. In rhetorical analysis, you may say that Martin Luther King Jr. establishes his credibility by using examples and evidence that are biblically based. And then you would give a quote, or you would integrate quotes and explain how that is an appeal to his credibility, while it can also act as an appeal to emotions. And then the L is linking, and that means you need to link the elements of your paragraph together. What does it mean? So this is you reaching a conclusion, or it could also be you including a transition from one idea in preparation for the next topic in the next sentence. So if you struggle where you feel like you're saying the same thing over and over again, or that it's too short but you don't know how to develop it, look at TEAL. Where do you need help? Do you need more evidence? Do you need more analysis? When you're peer reviewing, this is something you can evaluate and say, hey, you've made this statement, but you didn't give any evidence. What kind of evidence or example can you use to prove your point? Finally, a conclusion is the final appeal to your reader. Critical readers want to know the information is recent, reliable, relevant, and accurate, so make sure that you show them this with your conclusion. One of the complaints about Parker's essay is that it was written in 1971, or maybe even sooner. It's not necessarily recent, but it is reliable, given her evidence. It's relevant because we still deal with issues of poverty, and it's accurate as far as we can determine. Your job at the conclusion is not to restate, although that isn't a bad thing, but your job is to convince the reader that what is written is a relevant, meaningful addition to the conversation. Remind them of the logic of the argument that you've already laid down. Pull together the key components to answer the question, so what? Why are they listening? Why are they reading? And you can also place the argument in larger context. One of my favorite conclusions is to echo the introduction. It mimics the technique that you used in the introduction. So if you used a funnel, the inverted triangle, then you would go back out. And so using that example I did at the very beginning where I said, you go broad and then narrow down. With the opposite version, you'd start narrow and open it back up to the broad topic. So poverty at PPCC, poverty in Colorado Springs, poverty in Colorado, poverty in the US. It essentially gives the reader, it comes full circle and gives the reader that sense of completion. Good movies will also do that, and so that's a very good technique to use with the conclusion. Another technique is to challenge the reader. It creates a sense of urgency. Challenge the reader to act to change the status quo. Parker does this a little bit in her final conclusion. She doesn't want our pity, she says, but she wants you to be angry on her behalf because that's how change will happen. And so she's challenging the reader to step outside and not just read about poverty, but to do something about it. Looking to the future is a very good thing to do with quite a bit of research. It's relevant when you ask the reader to take action, so you oftentimes will see multiple techniques used in one introduction or one conclusion. When you look to the future, you're establishing that there is a persistent problem. So poverty is a problem. They were dealing with it in the 1960s, the 1970s, we're doing it now, and what happens if we don't deal with it, in what happens to our future. It asks about the consequences of letting the situation continue unchanged. Does it answer the question, so what? The reader wants to know, so what? So what do you want me to do? What do you want me to think, believe? Posing a question is a great way to end, and some of you are naturally doing this. It's designed as what we call a rhetorical question. It just means you're not expecting an answer, you're not answering it. This time, you're asking it to provoke them to think about something. You stimulate the reader to think about the implications of your argument. Think about, does the use of multiple questions add to the conclusion? So some of you guys wrote entire paragraphs that were all questions. That's not very effective because your job in an argument is to prove something, not to ask questions. But ending on a question is very effective because then you're putting the next thought on the reader. Instead of saying, I'm going to do this, the question is, what are you, the reader, going to do about this? Conclude with a quotation. The best part about this is it adds to your authority and your credibility when you use a quotation, particularly when it's relevant. It indicates what stance others have made, so you're kind of borrowing their credibility, and it adds poignancy to the argument, which just means the quality of evoking a keen sense of sadness or regret. So these are the kind of essays where you have a conclusion and they leave you feeling a little bit morose or a little bit sad because the quotation gives you that feeling of emotional resonance that you want with your reader, to be honest. So all 5 of these conclusion strategies are something I want you to try in your rhetorical analysis. The introduction is a little bit harder because with the rhetorical analysis, it's a formal essay. We have certain expectations for you to use in the introduction: situation, audience, and purpose, providing context and background information before you have a thesis. But the conclusion strategies are something that I want you to practice something that you feel would be a natural style for you. And instead of just being repetitive and telling the reader what you've already said, this is the way to cement their understanding of what you've already said. It does pull together the main claims of the essay. It shows the reader how the points fit together. It should answer the questions, show what, or to show the significance of the issue you're discussing. And it should also place the argument in a larger context. So if we're talking about poverty at PPCC, what are the broader implications? We've talked a couple times in the semester. Most recent research says 14% of community college students are homeless. So what are the broader implications of that across the country? Your conclusion strategy should also show readers what is new or how it adds to the conversation. Intentionally pick one of these strategies for your next paper so that I can see that you've internalized and you understand what these concepts are. When you do this in both the introduction and the conclusion, when you do this for other classes, you are demonstrating your skills in a way that will impress your instructors and earn you a better grade in other classes. Okay, so now it's time for asking questions.